So in chapter 14, we're going to be exploring feminist family therapy. And feminism is more than just a counseling theory or a counseling movement. Of course, we know that the feminist movement evolved and took place over several hundred years, revolving around equality and women's rights and the suffrage movement, all in this effort to challenge the male-driven nature of our society. And so there's a lot of social movements that involve this feminist idea, but we're going to focus on how that was incorporated into counseling and feminist counseling specifically for families. And so feminism in counseling is a postmodern approach. So again, rejecting that idea of the counselor as the expert, or as the counselor is the driver and person who determines the direction of counseling. And feminism really encompasses a lot of different approaches to therapy. So there's a lot of different options for counselors who subscribe to a feminist approach. So we aren't going to go over all of them because there are quite a few, but we'll talk about what they all generally have in common and the general approach with families and incorporating these feminist ideas and philosophies. And so some of the common beliefs that are shared amongst these different feminist approaches to counseling are really based on this idea that our current society was developed by men, and it was developed in a way that is very, there's this dominant culture similar to narrative, right? So there's this idea of a dominant culture that is based on white, Caucasian, heterosexual men and what they need, and advancements based on promoting that ideal. And so that this patriarchy, this male-driven society impacts people, impacts families, impacts the roles that people play in each other's lives. And so there's this idea of a normal family, which is a family with heterosexual parents, and the man is the head of the household. And so feminism, I think, gets a bad rap as being focused on maybe hating men or being anti-men, but really feminist theory says that men experience just as many issues as women do. Maybe not just as many, but they do experience issues within this cultural norm also, because there's a lot of different expectations, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of roles that are defined by a man's gender, just like there are for women, and so they can impact men just as negatively at times as women, depending on the circumstances. And so the idea behind feminist counseling is that both men and women would benefit from this approach because it creates more equality in relationships, which helps both find roles that maybe are not as aligned with gender, but more aligned with their own views and their own needs within a family system. And so there's this dominant cultural narrative still of heteronormative families, male-driven structure, and so this approach really considers the greater societal systems. So there are these considerations of power and privilege, and how those power and privileges can change relationships and change families. And so there's this challenge to the power and the gender roles that are being reestablished and established and reinforced by these societal systems. And so it's not just within the counseling room, but within the greater society as a whole. So there's this idea of how society impacts the individual, but how the individual and the therapist can also impact society. And so there's this commitment to redefining families and creating roles that promote egalitarian relationships and equality, regardless of gender. And there's this idea that, gender issues are impacting both men and women, and so by creating more equal relationships, you're giving an opportunity for both to use their voices equally and to define their own family system based on their own needs. There's also this idea of political motives, right? Because this grew out of a political movement, and there's this greater societal political system that's playing into what's happening in families. And so society is designed to benefit heterosexual white males, and so that creates some disenfranchisement and some negative impact on women, especially women of color or non-heterosexual women. People who don't fit into that dominant cultural narrative are negatively impacted by that cultural narrative. Some of this sounds familiar to narrative counseling, right? And this is common of all these postmodern approaches. And so these experiences of disenfranchisement, practically speaking, negatively impact wellness, especially for women of color, especially for non-heterosexual women. And so you experience things like depression and anxiety and issues in relationships, and all of those are reflective of this dominant cultural narrative that's negatively impacting the client. And so some of the general key concepts for feminist counseling, and again, this is kind of the common thread in all of these kind of different subsections or concentrations of feminist counseling, but generally the key concepts are around this idea of giving voice to and empowering women in families. And so this idea of creating the opportunity for more egalitarian roles and less of gender roles really defining what happens in families, and more of giving families opportunities to define for themselves in a more equal way the roles that are played in a family. And there's a lot of considering what happens in society impacting the individual and the individual impacting society. And so feminist counseling really talks about how you can't ignore the greater societal context of things. So the personal is political. So these things that are happening in your family are reflection of things that are happening in greater society. So it's not just you and your family, but it's the whole system. And so you have to consider all of it. And so part of that is this idea of advocacy and of the counselor and potentially even the family gaining this role of advocate. So advocating for your clients advocating for themselves, advocating for other disenfranchised members of their community, and pushing for the social transformation, pushing back against this dominant heterosexual male-dominated culture, because feminist counselors say that traditional therapy or more modern therapy approaches are reinforcing that dominant culture through the role of the therapist and through the views of families. But these postmodern views, and particularly feminist views, give more of an ear and more of an opportunity for disenfranchised members of society to be able to share voice and share equal direction in where therapy takes them. And so the goals in all of this are to challenge gender roles and stereotypes in the family system. So being able to really examine critically and talk about the needs of the family members, how those needs are being met or not met, and how gender roles are impacting the wellness of the family members, how they're impacting their interactions with each other, and how they're impacting the way that they view each other and treat each other. Because people don't always realize how much these gender roles and societal roles are impacting their lives. It's not something that we're used to talking about or considering. And so it might take a little work and a little time for your clients to really be able to wrap their head around the fact that this larger system, to which they really don't feel connected at all, is actually impacting and dictating a lot of their life and their family and the things that happen to them every day. And so part of it is raising awareness, but then also challenging those roles and stereotypes. And once you do that, you're able to help the family members redefine their own identity and roles and beliefs within their family structure and redesign it in a way that works better for them. And so the result and the overall goal of this whole process is really to create equal and egalitarian relationships within families and let people define their own roles based on who they are and what they need and what they are bringing into the family, as opposed to just reinforcing these dominant cultural narratives. And so in that, you're able to create these family dynamics that are really based on respect and nurturing and care for each other and choice and flexibility, and really defining your own roles and how those roles play out in terms of what happens within your family unit. so the role of the therapist in this whole process is to really help family members to create more equal and egalitarian relationships amongst family members, and to help bring awareness to these greater societal systems and this dominant cultural narrative that's impacting the family and informing a lot of decision making and interactions and roles that they're playing with each other. And so it's important to depathologize these experiences of disenfranchised women, especially because all of these labels and all of these issues and all of this dominant culture that's playing out is impacting the wellness of family members. And so someone who's feeling hopeless and like they're not being heard might receive a label of depression, of clinical depression. And so instead of just assigning a diagnostic label and pathologizing that experience, a feminist counselor would help that woman and then those in her family understand that what's impacting you is this greater system, and here's how it's impacting you, and here's how you can change that narrative in your own family. And so the counselor really plays this role of being a model, being a sounding board, and providing perspective for the family. So being able to provide empathy and nurturing and understanding to women in family systems so that everyone can get on the same page with what it really means to have an egalitarian and equality-based family unit. And so some shared techniques to help pursue these goals in feminist counseling are first and foremost to create egalitarian relationships. And so feminist theorists believed that you can't really address these dominant cultural narratives and this power differential between family members if there's a power differential between counselor and client. And so in feminist counseling, as there are efforts made from the very beginning to be able to create an egalitarian relationship between the counselor and the clients. And this happens through intake, through informed consent. Throughout this entire process, efforts are made to create equal partnerships between counselor and client, and for them to go together in this journey of navigating the counseling relationship. So really trying to first address and call attention to the power differential there, and then work with the client to be able to make them feel like they're an equal partner in the decisions made in the counseling process to try and minimize that power differential. Consciousness raising is a technique that can be used. It's pretty interesting and powerful, actually. So it's the idea that there's this leaderless group. So it's not led by a counselor. There's no person in the group that has more power than anybody else, because you'll see power as a recurring theme here. We can't address dominant narratives from a place of power. We have to address them from a place of equality, right? So through these consciousness raising process, this leaderless group is assembled, and the idea is that everyone in the circle is provided this safe and supportive space so that they can share their own truths, their own stories, their own awareness of things with other members of the group. And the members of the group would be nurturing and provide empathy and understanding and acceptance to all of the members that are sharing within the group. And so the idea being that you would be able to go to this group and share your stories, share your experiences, share awareness so that you can help address and call attention to this system of oppression that's impacting your life, and be able to be validated in that. So there's no criticism in this group, there's no necessarily challenging in this group. It's really just a place for people to feel accepted and equal to everyone else. And so it's this dialogue of being able to share and be heard, and in all of that to be able to gain awareness about the system of oppression and the dominant culture that's playing out for everybody in the group. Gender role and power analysis. So as one of the key components of this theory is identifying gender roles and power within relationships. So the counselor is constantly validating, providing empathy, noting, and addressing gender roles and how the gender roles are playing out amongst members of the family. And this can be between heterosexual couples, same-sex couples. Gender roles play out for everyone. It's not just in families that fit into this nuclear model, but everybody has gender roles. And those gender roles become even more confusing when you don't fit into that dominant cultural narrative, which can cause even more issues. So no matter who is in your room, you're going to be talking about gender roles and power now, and talking about power in relationships. Because if there are two people in a relationship, there's some kind of distribution of power. Somebody has a bigger voice than someone else in certain areas, and in some areas not. So addressing those gender roles, addressing how power is shared amongst members of a family, and then eventually calling attention to these things in a way that works towards a more shared power and more flexibility in creating roles within a family that are more attuned to the individual family members and less dominated by cultural norms. Self-disclosure can be used with this theory. As always, self-disclosure should be at the discretion of the therapist and should be used appropriately. But the idea is that by the counselor disclosing some things within the counseling session, maybe disclosing experiences that they've had or disclosing things within their own family at times, it can help address that power differential between counselor and client and can help validate the struggles of especially women in families. Just reiterating that they're not alone. They're not the only ones struggling with this. It's really because of this dominant cultural narrative that everybody is experiencing these things to some degree. It's not just the one that is in your counseling office, because societal norms affect everybody. So there's that idea of, again, reinforcing that it's not just you. It's not that you're depressed. It's that there's this dominant cultural narrative that's negatively impacting your life, and now how do we address that in your daily interactions with others? Bibliotherapy is a really big tool in feminist theory, in any feminist theory. So using movies, books, nowadays people use things like blogs, as long as it's from reputable sources, but the idea of providing other narratives, other perspective, other voices, especially ones that reinforce these feminist principles and reinforce power and equality. Providing the client with different ways to conceptualize the world really helps with addressing this narrative of the dominant culture, really helps in addressing power, really helps in the client being able to understand that it's not just them, but there's this bigger system at play that's impacting their life negatively. Assertiveness training is this idea of facilitating a process in counseling where women especially become more comfortable using their voice. And this theory really says that due to this dominant culture, women tend to be blamed, tend to fall into the role of victim, tend to be the scapegoat of the family, tend to not be able to use their voice as much or feel as much power in using their voice. And so this assertiveness training helps women to feel more comfortable with sharing their voice, but also for other members of the family to become more accustomed to hearing their voice instead of coming back from a place of defensiveness, because that's the reaction when you are on the other side of this dominant cultural narrative and it's being challenged. You tend to come from a place of defensiveness. And so for women to learn to be more assertive allows also for the other members of the family to practice hearing them without coming from that place of defensiveness. And so being able to share more open conversation and explore how all of the members of the family think and feel, and be able to practice expressing themselves in non-aggressive ways and hearing each other in non-defensive ways. Finally, there's this process of reframing and relabeling. We've talked about reframing before in different theories, but the idea within a feminist framework is that there are these cultural and societal norms, and so it's important to talk about that with your clients, to talk about how these things exist, they are impacting your life, and so in that you're counteracting that role of the woman as the victim, the woman as the scapegoat, the woman as the silent complainer. And so you're able to relabel what's going on in the family in a greater systemic context. So it's not just that you're not getting along, but it really seems like you're trying to fit into these gender roles that really just aren't working for you. So what can we do about that? And so you're reframing issues within the family to consider those cultural and societal norms that are negatively impacting them. So this is a pretty big shift, and it's focused on women and empowerment, but it really does benefit men just as much to be able to connect more with their partners in an equal way and hear about some of these societal issues without experiencing defensiveness, because there's a lot of anxiety that comes with the other side of this equation. So when you're on the beneficial end of a societal norm and things become more equal, you can start to experience anxiety and uncertainty and depression when some of that privilege is maybe shared with someone else. And so while a lot of this theory is focused on women, men really do benefit just as much from this family therapy approach, because when things truly are more equal and egalitarian, everybody feels heard, everybody feels supported, and everybody feels like they can share in roles and responsibilities in the family more based on who they are and less based on what they think they're supposed to be doing. And so feminist theory allows a lot of flexibility in being able to do that.